roads were muddy and hard to travel. The rivers cluttered with riverboats hauling goods and people to neighborhoods along the banks. This was life in a new nation barely 50 years old in the 1800s, in a small town called Allegheny, which is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This was a land filled with ethnic flavors from all across Europe, of immigrants and their families struggling to earn a better life for their children. They labored to carve roads into the countryside and anchor their tiny communities into the fiber of a rough but promising new world. They brought their work ethics, their languages, their customs from every corner of Europe. And they brought their faith, a faith in their Creator, to see them through their tragedies and share in their triumphs. A Creator who would bring them consolation and healing through His special messengers. They built their churches with their hearts and furnished them with their meager finances. This was America in the early 1800s, a difficult and harsh world requiring discipline and great personal sacrifice. In the spring of 1830, the mud-splattered frontier of the New World was more than just an ocean away. A baby boy was born in Belgium, son of a Protestant father and a Catholic mother who lavished the child with a lifestyle of luxury. His name was Suitbert, and his parents had great plans for him. Schooled in the best institutions throughout Europe, the young boy was fascinated by the practice of medicine. He had an affinity for people. He truly cared for them, and he wanted to use his medicine to help them ease their sufferings. But Suitbert realized that physical healing begins with the strength of the spirit within. Through conversations with his friends in the priesthood, he decided that the only way to effectively treat his patients was to combine the spiritual with the physical elements of medicine. Instead of choosing just one, he blended the two together and decided to follow a priestly lifestyle while still practicing medicine. When missionaries from the Catholic Church were recruiting for priests in the New World, it was a bold request. Life was rugged and unpredictable. It was savage by European standards. Few would undertake such a challenge, but when the ship for the New World sailed into port, Suitbert G. Mollinger knew it had come for him. He was not destined to walk among the wealthy, polished hallways of the royalty of Belgium. Rather, he was chosen to be the treasurer of one of the most priceless collections anywhere in the world. He was a determined man. Some would have even called him stubborn and hard. His rigorous German upbringing certainly demanded a unique and focused discipline from those around him. His stately countenance and formidable frame presented an impressive figure at nearly 6 feet tall. But Suitbert Mollinger's gentle features and easy smile punctuated a face brimmed by a full beard and capped by the beret of a priest.
He was big, in the nicest sense, and big in his accomplishments, big in his work for the Catholics with whom he labored as pastor no matter where. He was a big man.
He obviously had a stately bearing about him that allowed people to look at him with awe. And maybe that's why they also, in that process of looking at him with awe, saw that maybe there was something beyond this tall and stately man, that, God was working with him and through him in many ways for people's lives.
Suitbert G. Mollinger became Father Mollinger on April 30th, 1859, at the age of 28. He ministered in the Diocese of Erie, Pennsylvania, where he served for the following 6 years, before moving down to a small community near Pittsburgh called Wexford. While serving there, he established a mission parish in nearby Perrysville called St. Teresa of Avila, which still stands today. Eventually, Father Mollinger was transferred to a hilltop overlooking the tiny communities dotting the slopes around Pittsburgh. On July 4th, 1868, Father Mollinger became the first pastor of a small parish called Most Holy Name of Jesus in a tiny community named Troy Hill, an ethnic neighborhood composed mostly of German immigrants. Father Mollinger was home.
I think that they were people of a great faith, good, strong, and what I would say immigrant faith, which is the way the church was founded in this part of the world. These people brought over with them not only their ethnic backgrounds, which was varied, primarily German there though, and their customs, their recipes, their holiday customs, but they also brought over their faith, and they brought with them, in many instances, immigrant priests who could preach and minister to them in their own language. They could hear the hymns that they were familiar with, the religious customs for the different holidays. Very, very strong faith.
But suddenly, Father Mollinger was faced with the cold reality of the new world. Troy Hill was a working-class neighborhood, and money came hard. After a year of teaching children in one room in the back of the church, an effort to raise funds to build a school took nearly a year. Suitbert G. Mollinger was a long way from the royalty of Belgium. As Father Mollinger settled into his new environment, his parishioners began coming to him looking for more than just spiritual guidance. Father Mollinger's part-time pharmacy out back of the church was gaining a reputation for pills that cured. Even generations after Father Mollinger left Troy Hill, his pills were a regular part of the daily diet.
Oh, I know. Oh, his tonic was horrible. Every kid on Troy Hill had to take it. Ugh. It was thick, it was yellow, and it was pretty hard to swallow. But you took Father Mollinger's tonic. I guess it was mostly all cod liver oil, but it had a few other things in it too. There was all sorts of medication that he had, in boxes and bottles and powders, pills.
But the Diocese of Pittsburgh didn't care for priest dispensing pills. Still, church officials could not refute the effects and couldn't keep the faithful from coming to the small parish in search of some relief for their ailments. They just hoped the people were coming for all the right reasons. While Father Mollinger was busy prescribing potions and pills, he began to make plans for a rectory. Too many visitors were stopping by the tiny church room he called home, and he was in need of more space. And his own hobby, collecting religious artifacts and relics, was turning his room into a museum. Most Holy Name of Jesus Parish would need to expand. But the parish couldn't afford a rectory. The money just wasn't available. Meanwhile, the same economic pinches felt on Troy Hill were creating another, less predictable impact in other parts of the world. Economic conditions in Europe, for example, were forcing owners of unusual and rare artifacts to make them available to collectors in the open market. Among those artifacts were religious relics, which allowed Father Mollinger's collection to grow quickly.
Remember, he made many trips back over to Europe to acquire relics. He was wealthy, he had the money to pay for them, and they knew that, and so there was no hesitation in acquiring almost anything. And the times were right. This was the most important. At no other time in the history of the church would so many of these been let loose for public acquiring.
But still the question of where to put the artifacts. As the collection grew, the question became more pressing. Father Mollinger decided to build his rectory on the grounds at Most Holy Name of Jesus Parish. Since he knew the tiny congregation could not afford to build him a home, he bought the property himself from his own funds and built his own residence. But even then, housing religious artifacts in a home instead of a church just didn't seem right. Father Mollinger felt that a new, larger church should be built. The church committee disagreed.
Father Mollinger had a dream of building a giant church up here, and in that church, the relics would eventually be displayed rather than just simply displayed over in his home. But he wanted them to be displayed in a church. But the people here were poorer people, and the church committee at the time, whenever he presented this idea to the church committee of building a huge church, were against the idea simply because they didn't know if it was financially feasible for them to go to such a length at that time to spend that much money on building a church the size that Father Mollinger had in mind.
They were deadlocked. Father Mollinger was determined to build a bigger church to properly house his collection, and the committee was concerned that the congregation could not financially support his dream. So, Father Mollinger reached back into his own pocket and in 1880 started a small chapel in which to house his collection of relics. This building later became known as St. Anthony's Chapel. Now the stream of faithful became a small river. They were coming from miles away, from states away, from countries away, all to see an aging priest with a healing reputation. But somehow, these healings were different. Where skeptics could once claim psychosomatic cures or overactive imaginations on the part of a religious few, the cures became more difficult to explain away in conventional terms. Cripples were dropping their crutches and walking home. Sick children were recovering without pills. And then there was a woman with a withered hand.
She had a withered hand, and her husband had told her to go to St. Anthony's Chapel, that he cures people that are sick, that he really is a doctor. And she went, and for a penance, he told her that she had to walk in the heat of day up those river steps, and they are long. And then he'd pray over her, and he'd tell her that she wasn't allowed to eat meat on Friday. She didn't give a darn because she was all right. She thought it wouldn't come back.
Yeah.
And here it did. And then she got scared, and she told her husband, he said, well, you march right up there and talk to him. And she didn't like that. But she went, and he scolded her, and he told her, don't ever come back here again. He said, I'll try this time yet, but never again. He says, I'm not praying day and night for somebody that's that careless like you. So she never ate any meat on Friday anymore.
Healing, once a dream for a young idealistic student in the finest European medical schools, it was quickly becoming his reputation. But medical science and healings of faith often seemed at opposite ends. Some cures simply defy basic scientific explanations. Was Father Mollinger truly endowed with a divine gift? And why was his chapel named for St. Anthony?
St. Anthony was probably special to Father Mollinger because of St. Anthony's connection with healing. And Father Mollinger, probably studying in Italy, went around to some of the famous shrines in Italy, and I'm sure that he probably visited Padua in that whole process. And St. Anthony is probably one of the most popular saints in the church next to the Blessed Mother or St. Joseph. So St. Anthony was a natural candidate to be his favorite patron saint.
Who was the real St. Anthony? To find that answer, we need to go back to the late 1100s and Lisbon, Portugal. Ferdinand de Bolhos was the son of a knight at the court of King Alfonso II of Portugal. He studied under the church there and was ordained around 1219. He joined the Franciscans a year later and adopted the name Anthony. His sermons were noted for their poignant fire and eloquence, and he attracted enormous crowds wherever he preached. By 1226, he was living in Padua, Italy, a city he reformed through his preaching prowess. 5 years later, he was afflicted with dropsy and died on June 13, 1231. He was canonized a saint a year later and declared a doctor of the church in 1946. One of his nicknames is the Wonder Worker, and he is known to be the patron saint of lost causes. As you will soon see, Father Mollinger's story is surprisingly similar. It was finally happening. After years of difficult battles over the proper way to display his collection of relics, St. Anthony's Chapel had moved out of the planning stages and into construction. In the process, Father Mollinger's collection of relics had grown to nearly 5,000 pieces, some of them reportedly dating back to the Old Testament prophets. With each relic is a document called an authentic, with the wax seal of a bishop of the area stating that the relic is believed to be genuine. But as with all collecting, it's hard to be absolutely certain of complete authenticity.
You cannot make a sweeping assertion that everything in here is authentic. I wouldn't do that. I don't think anybody can do that. But you can pretty much say that maybe 85% of them are, because of the authentics. I've had them looked at, out at the Hunt Library.
First of all, there's no question about the authenticity of those that have the paper. And how many of those there are, I really don't know. But no one claims that they all have papers. Yeah. Actually, when they get out of ecclesiastical hands, it's very odd to even think of the paper accompanying them. So that all you have is the relic, and you don't have any proof of its authenticity. Those relics are issued by the church, and if you have the paperwork, they vouch for the authenticity of it. And the vouching is sealed. As long as the seal's not broken, it's valid.
It was now late in the 19th century, and Father Mollinger's small chapel was nearly complete. He decided to make a trip to Europe himself to look for even more artifacts. What he found in Germany stunned him.
After Father Mollinger had completed the first part of the chapel, he made a trip to Munich, Germany. And in the process of being in Munich, he found a place where they were carving the Stations of the Cross. And he immediately wanted a set of these stations for his own chapel. So he went about purchasing these Stations of the Cross to be shipped over to the United States. And then he came back here with measurements, so on and so forth, to begin the process of building an addition onto the chapel.
And so they sat in their packing boxes over in our churchyard for 2 years, in the rain and the wind and the snow, until he got the money together to start to build on the addition to his simple little devotional chapel, just to house the Stations of the Cross. He started that in 1890, and it was all finished and ready for dedication on June the 13th, 1892.
The process never seemed to end. As he found more relics, he needed more space, only to find more relics. In all, the chapel came to hold 525 relic cases, some containing the tiniest of fragments of holy people or places. St. Anthony's Chapel is now believed to hold one of the largest collections of relics anywhere in the world, second only to the Vatican's storehouse of treasures.
Even in the Vatican, there's no such concentration of relics as there are in this chapel. It is just unbelievable that one man in one lifetime could do this.
12 years after the original construction began, Father Mollinger's dream was almost a reality. He decided to dedicate the chapel on June 13, 1892, the feast day of St. Anthony. But the man who had labored so often to cure the sick and comfort the suffering was now in poor health himself. He had gained weight. He struggled to travel even short distances. Like his patron saint, Father Mollinger was diagnosed as suffering from dropsy. But he was determined to see his project through to completion. By the summer of 1892, the chapel was finished. Newspaper accounts of the dedication day describe a community with streets packed with visitors from all over the world, looking to meet Father Mollinger and to see this little chapel and the treasures within. Father Mollinger was alone in his finished chapel for the first time and was finally able to pause and marvel at his impressive collection. His life's work was finally done. It was the Feast of St. Anthony, June 13, 1892. After a few moments alone with his relics and with his patron saint, Father Mollinger walked to the front door of the chapel and led in the celebration.
Were thronged with people. My grandparents told me how you couldn't move on Troy Hill. People were renting out their hallways, their porches, anything. The house next door, you see how it's built with a double stairway going up? That was one of the houses for the pilgrims. I have a receipt for $1 written on just a piece of brown paper sacking to sleep in a hallway. Anywhere they could find relief. And even Father Mollinger would let any of his patients, he would let them rest in the back of the rectory, and he would serve them like a little light lunch if they had come from a long way. And so everybody was waiting for the great morning.
That day, Father Mollinger dedicated his chapel with a mass for the faithful who had come to see him. But by early afternoon, he wasn't feeling well and retired to his rectory for rest. The sick and suffering who came to see him were disappointed at the news that Father Mollinger would not be able to see them until tomorrow, but they would wait.
So Father retired and to bed, laid down anyways, and thought that maybe after a bit of a rest he would be spry again and go about his chores. But that wasn't to be the case. It almost killed him, evidently, to come out eventually and speak to the crowd and say that he was sorry, but he couldn't see anybody privately. And then he was taken by the arm on each side and led back into the house.
Dr. King came, and then he called 2 other doctors. I can't think of their names right now, but I do have them at home. And they examined the patient and then decided that only an operation would save him.
By June 15, 2 days after he dedicated his chapel and life's work, Father Suitbert G. Mollinger was dead. The cause of his death, the same dropsy that once claimed his patron St. Anthony of Padua. And like St. Anthony, Father Mollinger never returned home to his native land. Both sons of men in royal courts, Father Mollinger and St. Anthony had earned reputations for working wonders. But there would be no more cures for the crowds waiting outside. Troy Hill was silent.
And of course, the whole world, it seemed to us, was plunged into mourning. But even after his death, the fame of the chapel still carried on.
What remained behind him was a legacy of caring for the people of his tiny immigrant parish. And then there was the chapel. 5,000 relics in 525 cases from all over the world and from some of the most important moments in the history of the Catholic Church and earlier. What would become of this little chapel and what was really in it anyway?
Then the times were right, because in the late 1800s, the House of Piedmont rose up an army against the church. It was under the direction of Garibaldi, and as we know from the history books, They were successful. From this was created the Vatican. And of course, the first thing the soldiers did was to loot the monasteries and churches, knowing that this was the seat of wealth. Well, all the relics and all the reliquaries, of course, became loosened onto the public. They were actually being hawked in the streets because who wanted these things in their homes? People at this time were very superstitious, and they were sort of reluctant to touch anything so holy in a public way. And so Father Mollinger and friends were scooping up these things for him that he had missed himself by coming over here, and they were sending them up here to this little muddy hilltop.
The extent of Father Mollinger's collection surprised even many of his closest friends. Beyond the size of this collection, it was the incredible stories of some of the pieces which made this collection most impressive.
St. Demetrius, do you know where he got those? I have the letter, and it's so beautiful. It says, "The bones of St. Demetrius, the martyr, which you have procured in Rome." This letter tells you so much. "I have taken to the Cistercian convent in Landshut. There they will take each bone and wrap it in pure white silk and embellish it with threads of gold and silver leaves and flowers. These in turn will be placed on a red velvet box for viewing, and then placed in the precious case which you have ordered from August Whitty in Aachen. These will be a thing of beauty forever." You see, St. Demetrius has on a wreath. That is a wreath of victory, and that's victory over death through martyrdom.
These were more than just trinkets and collectibles. These were glimpses into real-life saints, brought out of folklore and into living legacy by actual pieces of the Church's past. For many, their faith was made real by seeing objects from their religious upbringings, but for others, it was simply a reinforcement of what they already knew to be true. The Bible was not merely a philosophical story, but a living history book. But St. Anthony's Chapel was never quite the same without Father Mollinger. After all, it was his passion which first brought the chapel off the drawing board and into the hearts of the people of Troy Hill. Crowds began to diminish and interest faltered. Donations fell off steadily until the chapel fell into serious disrepair. Even the efforts of local school children to clean and take care of the chapel couldn't stop the persistent whispers of demolition. Finally, after nearly 100 years of apathy and neglect, the people of Troy Hill stood up for one of their own.
Fewer and fewer people came. And for 89 years, the chapel sat here without anyone taking care of it.
Coal dust, especially that sort of thing, come in through the cracks inevitably. That was not removed, and of course that coated a whole lot of the statuary.
Even though the task was noble, the reality was startling. Repair work would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and Troy Hill was still a working-class neighborhood. That kind of money would be hard to find. Moreover, since the chapel had originally been built with private funds instead of church money, the Diocese of Pittsburgh would offer no help. If Troy Hill wanted its chapel, Troy Hill would have to fight for it by itself.
I was frankly surprised to see the kind of interest that it generated, because Holy Name Parish itself didn't have a lot of money to put into it. And when the pastor spoke to me about the renovation, I said, well, who's going to pay for it? He said, the committee. Said, they'll do it. He said, I told them I can't help you out. And I said, well, God bless them. You know, if they think they can do it. Well, I was astonished. And it was a sign to me of the great faith. There'd be no other reason why they were doing it. They weren't going to get rich on it. But they cherished and venerated that building so much that if they went out and they raised the money. And that, to me, is a very, very ample proof of how strong the faith still is.
The old slate roof was sliding off, and the plaster walls were peeling. Linoleum floor tiles were curled and difficult to walk on. Portions of the ceiling littered the chapel pews and floor. Only a last-minute successful effort to name the chapel a historic landmark saved the building from the wrecking ball. And renovation was still a long way away. And so the tedious task of raising the money began. The chapel committee sold slate roofing tiles, had small sales, even gave speeches and collected donations for its efforts. Money came mostly in pennies and nickels, not in dollars. But through the tireless efforts of the committee and some of the residents of Troy Hill, the money began to build. Slowly. It took nearly 6 years to raise the couple $100,000 needed to save St. Anthony's Chapel. By the time the chapel celebrated its 100th birthday on June 13, 1992, the renovation was newly completed. After a century on Troy Hill, Father Mollinger's little hobby had become a showcase reliquary. Now, it's mostly quiet. The crowds are much thinner than in the late 1800s. And only a few dedicated souls seem to know the history of St. Anthony's Chapel in Pittsburgh. But those who come never forget the experience.
For me, I find great peace in here, especially in the evenings, because many times I come in here and make a holy hour, and there's no one in here, and I feel honored to be among all the relics of the saints and the Blessed Sacrament.
I think St. Anthony's Chapel is a place that gives a great deal of people a sense of hope and a sense of faith and a sense of renewal. I'm sure that there are many people who come here who in one way or another find something, maybe a sense of faith or maybe a sense of hope, or maybe even find a sense of peace inside of themselves that brings about healings for them in their lives.
Is a reliquary really a museum of tiny mementos of special people? Or is it a living memorial to their memories?
Now, in the church, we have held on to the remains of those people, and the remains of those people have been held as sacred and special objects. In a sense, like today, A thing that would be very important to us would be photographs, pictures of people that we love. Kodak has been very good to us in having us hold on to the moment, or capture a moment, or possess a moment. And sometimes those moments become all the more precious to us, especially after we've lost someone that we love. In the same way, these relics are very precious for the faithful of the Church, because all of the people whose relics are here were precious to the history of the Church.
Having an appreciation for history, both secular and religious. The secular history, the museum, has its place and appreciation. The spiritual collection, spiritual museum, if you will, has its place. When I want to teach my kids about the world history, the Egyptology and things like that, et cetera, the dinosaurs, you go to the Carnegie. And I want to teach my kids about the lives of the saints and how they should pattern their lives, as we are called to do. One day, my son or your son, we're all called to be saints. Their artifacts could be here.
Father Mollinger started his life surrounded by luxury and ended his days surrounded by saints. And just as history survives historians, the story of St. Anthony's Chapel did not die when Father Mollinger's life ended. It simply started a new chapter in a never-ending story.